It's the 31st of July, and you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast on economies and markets from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 23rd episode. No geopolitical issue is perhaps more consequential to our times than the simmering China-US friction. Last week, during our biennial conference, Eurasia Group's Robert Kaplan said the US and China have diametrically opposed ambitions and goals in the South and East China Sea, hence a conflict is inevitable. Professor Kishore Mahbubani in the same conference cast the discussion in a long-term civilizational context, seeing China's rise as merely a return to trend for an ancient power, which the established but relatively young superpower the US is struggling to come to terms with. So clearly, China-US strife is here to stay. But what does it mean for our region here in Asia? Today, we talk about that with Dr. Lynn Kuok, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Dr. Kuok oversees Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment, one of the Institute's signature publications, and the Southeast Asian Young Leaders Program. She's responsible for developing research on key Asia-Pacific security issues. Welcome to Kopi Time, Dr. Kuok.
Thanks so much for having me, Taimur.
That's great. Hey, you and your colleagues at IISS recently published the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment 2020. Just as an advertisement for your publication, share with us some of the key themes explored in it.
Well, I think there are two overarching themes. The first one is that of major power competition and how that continues to grow in the region. So within that broad theme, there are assessments of the US-China relationship, as well as an examination of the implications for Asian security of the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as a look forward at the trajectory of Washington's alliances and security partnerships in the region, and also, of course, an assessment of the continuing challenge posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs, not just to the security of the United States, but to Japan and South Korea as well. Under the second overarching theme, that looks at the contributions that middle powers make to Asia-Pacific security. So within this broad heading, we look at Japan's increasingly assertive regional role, as well as the implications of worsening relations between Japan and Korea, as well as how Indonesian policy towards issues like the South China Sea continues to evolve, as well as the role played by Australia, as well as countries in Europe in seeking to support the balance of power as well as the rules-based order in the region.
Wow, that's a broad sweep, a critical sweep, and I wish we had the time and scope to go over each and every one of them, but this is just a short podcast, so I suppose we will stick with the first theme in your annual assessment, which is the China-US relationship. We at DBS have had quite a bit of exposure to this issue in the last week or so. In our Asia Insights conference last week, we discussed this with Robert Kaplan of Eurasia and Kishore Mahbubani of National University. We had a client call just a couple of days ago with Ambassador John Emerson, who used to be U.S. Ambassador in Germany. And although different people of different focus, it's been all back to this issue of the great power rivalry that we're seeing. And clearly, it's been deteriorating over the last couple of years. So perhaps you can start off giving us your assessment of what has driven this deterioration in US-China relationship.
Well, I think there's a tendency to pin the blame on President Trump. And certainly, I think he's driven part of the problems. He's taken a rather transactional approach towards China in terms of insisting that China purchase more from the United States. So his trade war hasn't helped relations, and now his seizing upon the China threat issue to boost his re-election chances as well has hurt US-China relations. But my view is that we've basically had a slow fire burning in the US-China relationship for quite a while, and it's now coming to a boil. We've seen relations rocky over a whole range of issues, the South China Sea, trade, technology, developments in Hong Kong, and its implications for Taiwan and human rights. I think there's I think with so many issues which are problematic in the relationship, any relationship would be under some stress. But I think what we've seen with the relationship is that these issues, in a sense, have become less thorns in the side of the relationship, causing its deterioration, say in the last quarter of last year, but rather these issues have become means by which the other side has sought to gain advantage over the other. And this in turn has at its heart great power competition and a fundamental anxiety about the other's intentions. And I think that, in a sense, is driving current US-China relations, not trade or the South China Sea per se. Those are certainly problematic issues, but the fact that both sides distrust each other and are seeking ways by which to keep the other in check. Now, I don't think US goals are particularly clear, but looking at observing its actions or words over the last couple of years, I think we can identify three possibilities in terms of its goals. The first possibility, and probably the most reasonable, is to ensure that China plays by the rules. So we want powers to adhere to international law and norms, even as competition becomes fierce between them. So that might be the objective that the United States seeks. But as we've gone along, I think we've also seen increasing propensity for the United States as well to ensure that China does not surpass U.S. power and influence in Asia. And we see that in the fight in the US, in the South China Sea. I think we see China seeking to exclude the United States from the South China Sea, and the United States signaling that it's a power that's here to stay. And the third possible objective, and we've seen that in the last month or so, and this has been increasingly disturbing, is a possible objective that the United States wants to change the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP itself. And I think we've seen US words and actions, I think, increasingly suggest that it's either the second or the third goal that the United States seeks to achieve.
Lynn, wow, you've taken us to rather challenging aspects of this matter quite quickly. So let's talk about the second and the third. The second one, I think it's clear, even in areas of trade and tech, the sort of market access and investment restrictions that the US government has put in place, which in some ways have actually gotten pushback from the US business community, but they've gone ahead nonetheless. But as far as areas beyond that, where the ostensible goal is to get China to play by rules, but seems to be the real goal is not allow China to surpass the US. The one that I would like you to touch a little more on is this issue of Asia, that there is this competition for Asia's soul and Asia's might between the US and the Chinese. What is the historical context which makes the US feel so strongly about holding on to its sort of hegemonic control over the region?
I think the US sees that it is a Pacific power, or now it calls itself an Indo-Pacific power, and it has a desire to reassure the allies to which it has given security commitments, Japan, the Philippines, that South Korea, that it has the wherewithal to actually stay in the region and support stability in the region. And I think this is something, we talk about US hegemony, but this is as if it was something negative. But in a sense, US presence in the region has allowed the region to enjoy a security umbrella which has kept Asia out of the rain for some decades now and allowed it to prosper. If we take away that umbrella, what we might well see is, say, Japan, South Korea going nuclear, which would deeply destabilize the region. And we might also see less of a balance of power in the region. And so we might have bigger countries in the region seeking to exert coercion on smaller countries in the region. And I think that is something that we should seek to avoid. So the US is doing it both for its own interests, commercial and other interests in the region, as well as supporting its allies. But I think also the region appreciates the US presence here. And I think we saw that quite clearly in the recent foreign affairs commentary that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong did for the Foreign Affairs magazine.
That's right. But Lynn, when you say the US, do you mean that the US military, the strategic thinkers in the US military, the State Department, the Washington, D.C. intelligentsia, they all have this view, or there is a tendency that whoever comes to the White House gets swayed by the US military establishment, which is perhaps a little more hawkish on these issues than the civilians would be?
I don't think it's correct to say, I don't think it's necessarily correct to say that there is a difference of opinion between the civilian and the military leadership on the issue of China, for instance. I think whether it's the White House, the State Department, or the Department of Defense, I think they've all issued policy statements since 2017, all identifying China as a as a threat for the United States. And I think they're all working at EDM. They're all working to the same set of policy goals, namely to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific.
And you see also as something that spans the political spectrum, that the fact that Trump and the Republicans are in power now and that Biden and the Democrats may be in power a year from now, that won't necessarily change the substance of this matter.
I think we're still seeing some lack of clarity in terms of what the United States' ultimate goals are, as we discussed earlier. But I think the view of China as a threat is shared across the aisle. And we've seen Republicans and Democrats agree on precious little during this administration. And we've seen great division within the United States. But I think on the issue of China, the main voices sing in unison. So I don't expect to see very much of a change, say, if Joe Biden were to come into power and it were a Biden administration. There might be marginal changes in terms of rhetoric. So perhaps rhetoric might be less inflammatory, and that would be a good thing because that could bring about more stable relations between the two superpowers, even if fierce competition persists. But I think we are going to see US-China rivalry competition in a quite heated state for some years to come. And indeed, even under a Biden administration, we might actually see competition become fiercer. We generally see a Democratic administration place greater emphasis on human rights. And talking to some of the people who know his Asia advisors, these Asia advisors there's some of them that are fairly ideological in their approach too. So it's not so much, China's behavior is problematic, though it certainly is, but China or the CCP is evil, and we need to ensure that we push back against this evil empire. We saw hints of that in Secretary Pompeo's address at the Nixon Library. I think it was last week.
That's right.
And he adopted a very strident ideological stance, calling communists liars, and saying that we need to disbelieve and verify everything rather than believe but verify. And we saw several, I read several Democratic commentaries after that, and their objections were less with the ideological approach adopted by Secretary Pompeo, but more by the fact the objections lay more in the double standards of the Trump administration that has, undermined multilateralism, which could be a tool in pushing back against China, and also its double standards in, abetting in their view, abetting and destroying democracy at home. So it wasn't so much the content of the speech that some of these analysts objected to, but the double standards in the current US administration, in their view, not walking the talk, right? So
No, I was on a call with Ambassador John Emerson a couple of days ago. He served both under Clinton and Obama, and he did not come across as some sort of a dove as far as China was concerned. And but the one thing that he pointed out, and I think that's already implicit in what you have said, is that a democratic administration may focus on the first pillar that you mentioned, which is the play by the rules aspect, and also the other issue that you just touched upon, that maybe focus more on multilateral approaches to dealing with China as opposed to a unilateral approach. Lynn, the third pillar that you talked about, which is the most troubling one and perhaps could create the most amount of global stress, is this notion that Secretary Pompeo and others would want to put so much pressure on China that it creates some sort of a change dynamic within the CCP. Explore a little bit of that for us, please.
Yeah, let me first have a look at the play by the rules and the multilateralism.
Sure.
And multilateralism. I think we cannot stress enough how important these objectives are, because I think we are seeing a situation where there is a complete lack of trust between the two superpowers, and we're not going to be able to restore that trust anytime soon. So the mechanisms by which we ensure that however heated competition is, it still takes place within a certain framework. What that framework is first, international law and norms, so playing by these rules, and second, multilateral institutions, which and the rules that those set out, and however much competition takes place, that should those frameworks, the competition must always take place within those frameworks to ensure that things don't get out of hand. So that is critical, and I think we as the international community need to look more closely at these issues as mechanisms by which to keep competition in check. Now, on regime change, I mean, it's important to stress that Secretary Pompeo never talked about regime change. He shied away from using those words, but he did talk about the Chinese people needing to change the CCP, and that change dynamic, as you pointed out, is hugely concerning. I think I worry about an overemphasis on an ideological approach. First, because it unnecessarily deepens tensions between the two great powers. These powers, China and the United States, have legitimate grievances against the other. And I think if we focus on those grievances, they are difficult to resolve. But once you start talking about the other side, as evil by their very nature, those issues, which are thorns in the side of the relationship, become much, much harder to resolve. So first, an ideological approach deepens tensions, unnecessarily deepens tensions. And I think the other reason why I find this deeply concerning is, quite apart from how China might view this, we also have to think about how other potential US partners and allies think about this issue. Now, on the very day that Secretary Pompeo talked about communists being liars, the United States actually signed a memorandum of understanding with Vietnam, promising to help Vietnam in its fight against illegal fishing. And this was, of course, targeted or directed at China's encroachments or illegal encroachments into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. But Vietnam is not a liberal democracy by any standards, and I'm not sure how it would have taken to the United States calling all communists liars. And I'm sure at the back of its mind, Vietnam must be thinking about how reliable a partner the United States can be, given this push towards an ideological war. The flip side, of course, of this is, how the United States might think about its allies and partners in the region. Secretary Pompeo talked about a coalition of democracies. Now, a coalition of democracies, by its very definition, might exclude certain very important partners in the region. Vietnam is one, Singapore is another. If we look at Southeast Asia, I don't think there is a liberal democracy in sight. So is the United States, by an overly ideological approach, would it alienate potential partners to its own detriment? And third, I think the third problem I think would be if it could leave a strategic space open for China, which could in a sense, be counterproductive to the very objectives that the United States seeks to achieve, namely democracy. So if it decides that our partners can only be democracies, and that hasn't happened yet, thankfully, then what does that mean for, who countries choose to position themselves with? If they go with China, and what does that mean for any gains, any democratic gains in the countries moving forward? So I think on several counts, deepening of tension, alienating of potential partners, as well as opening strategic space towards China, I think this hint at regime change or a movement towards a more ideological approach is deeply, deeply troubling.
Right. So that's the unintended consequence. If you push too hard and you have all these countries which are not keen on taking sides, then you inadvertently give China some space to maneuver. So let's explore that a little further. You talked about the China-Vietnam-US nexus and how things are getting complicated there. So what does this worsening of tension mean for the other countries in the region? Which are the ones you think are the biggest flashpoints going forward?
Well, I wouldn't say flashpoints. I think it's quite clear that the tensions between the two superpowers are, first of all, clearly hurting prospects of recovery from the pandemic, just on a purely health perspective, from a health perspective. But it's also hurting prospects for growth moving forwards, right? And beyond that, I think, less obviously, it's also worsening, the worsening relations also narrow countries' strategic options. The United States often says that it's not forcing countries to choose between the two superpowers, but I think many will find it difficult, if not impossible, to avoid taking sides in a world that's increasingly decoupled, whether in economic or technological spheres, whatever the United States might say. And as PM Lee pointed out in his recent article for Foreign Affairs, this places most countries in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, in a very difficult bind because the US security presence is critical for the region, and China will find it very difficult to step into this role, even if it wanted to, and even if it were trusted by the region, despite its increasing military strength. It's just nowhere near the United States at the moment. The United States, moreover, continues to be the largest source of foreign direct investments in much of Asia. And China, on its part, is the largest trading partner of most Asian countries, including all US allies in the region, and it has been ASEAN's largest trading partner for over a decade. And countries looking out towards China also look at, China having the wind behind its economic sails. So in a sense, having to choose between the United States and China is perceived in the region as having to choose between security and economic growth and prosperity. And it's quite a difficult position to be placed in for countries in the region.
Absolutely. I remember being in a dialogue with General Luhut of Indonesia, and he echoed exactly what you said, that he felt that, a country like Indonesia, for example, has found it very much to its interest to have deep military cooperation with the U.S. Navy and generally speaking, U.S. military, but at the same time, the deep trade relationship with China is an indispensable one. And I think he sort of thundered in the talk that I heard that nobody should ask Indonesia to pick a side because it is not a viable or realistic option for Indonesia to pick a side. The other issues, of course, the navies facing each other or their planes flying from their aircraft carriers and flying very close to each other in the South China Sea region. And then there's, of course, all these challenges that the US and other countries in Southeast Asia have made towards China as far as its overtures in the South China Sea is concerned. Where are things going there? I mean, this worsening of relationship, could that spill over into military tension in South China Sea?
Yes, I fear it could. I think what we're seeing in the South China Sea is increasingly worrisome. We've seen, even during the course of the past 7 months, during the pandemic, an increase in Chinese activities in the South China Sea. And this has taken various forms. So the first type of activity that we've seen China increase. China has actually increasingly encroached upon the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia, Vietnam, and most recently Malaysia. And such incursions have sometimes been quite violent. It sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat, and it has harassed. That wasn't violent, but it sought to harass the West Capella drillship, which was conducting survey operations for Malaysia's state oil company Capella. This is in clear violation of international law. A tribunal in the Philippines case against China actually found that the coastal states in the south, around bordering the South China Sea, are able to enjoy the exclusive economic roads unencumbered by China's 9-dash line or any claimed exclusive economic zone from features or group of features. So that's been problematic. And the second the second activity that China's been engaging in the South China Sea has been to maintain a near constant presence around features occupied or administered by other countries, including the largest feature the Philippines occupies in the Spratlys, the T2 Island. It first sent vessels to surround this feature in December 2018, and since then we've had at times hundreds of Chinese vessels surround this. So there are increasing numbers of Chinese vessels rubbing up against the vessels of other Southeast Asian countries, and that can pose potential problems in terms of incidents at sea. But China's activities in the South China Sea have not been confined merely to skirmishes with its smaller Southeast Asian neighbors. It also continues to object to assertions of maritime rights and freedoms by the United States and its allies. And I think, as you point out, this is very worrying, given an environment of heightened tensions between the US and China, and including recriminations around COVID-19. So it's a very bad environment. And just a couple of months ago in April, we saw US and Chinese warships come within just 100 meters of each other, which greatly increased the risk of incident. And the last time this happened was a near miss in September 2018, when, against a backdrop of worsening US-China trade relations, a Chinese warship came within 41 meters of a US warship while it was conducting a freedom of navigation operation in the Spratlys. And that warship had to maneuver just to avoid a collision. So these recent near misses, I think, are worrying, not only because China decided to, in a sense, interfere in lawful assertions of maritime rights and maritime rights in the South China Sea, but also because they were in breach of a memorandum of understanding with which the United States Department of Defense and China's Ministry of National Defense entered into in November 2014, which seeks to regulate the behavior of both parties so that they can safely encounter each other both at sea and in the air. So I think, an environment of deteriorating relations, an environment where, agreements for safety, safe encounters at sea and air are breached, an environment where there are increasing number of vessels, of Chinese vessels rubbing up against, both Southeast Asian vessels as well as US vessels and allied vessels. It's a very bad environment, and one that is ripe for potential incidents at sea.
Lynn, that's very helpful. And you have explained to us in great detail how this looks from the nations in Southeast Asia, how this looks from the perspective of the US. Exact same set of escalations and developments, how are they looking in Beijing?
Well, Beijing obviously has quite a different perspective on the South China Sea. It sees itself as sovereign over the features in the South China Sea, and therefore entitled to reclaim or to transform small features into large artificial islands, build air and naval facilities on them, as well as to militarize them, because these are the prerogatives of a sovereign nation. However, I think it's wrong in that respect, because these features in the South China Sea, or sovereignty over these features in the South China Sea, is hotly disputed. And in the case of at least one feature in the Spratlys, or two features in the Spratlys, Mischief Reef and second on the show, the tribunal in the Philippines case against China in 2016 actually found these to be low tide elevations within the Philippines EEZ and therefore within the Philippines jurisdiction and control. China also claims that it has historic rights around in the South China Sea within its 9-dash line. And this has been an argument that it's made as it encroaches on the exclusive economic zone of other Southeast Asian countries. But I think that argument or that perspective has been rejected by the tribunal when it found that insofar as China was claiming historic rights to maritime zones recognized under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, these were not valid. The tribunal also rejected any Chinese claimed exclusive economic zone from features in the Spratlys in the South China Sea. So, that's not really a valid perspective. China also objects to U.S. and allied assertions of maritime rights and freedoms in the South China Sea. It's quite technical, so I'm not going to go into that. But again, these contravene the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and these powers are perfectly entitled to exercise high sea freedoms within the international waters of the South China Sea. There are also several narratives that China's pushing. One of them is that it's not China that has been destabilizing the South China Sea, but really foreign powers which are stirring up trouble in the South China Sea. I think that is something that flies in the face of facts, because we've seen various countries in Southeast Asia actually, to lesser or greater degrees, caution against or decry worrying developments in the South China Sea. And I think those were very subtle but clearly targeted at China. So from China's perspective, China does have certain perspectives on these issues, but whereas it might have valid concerns in certain other areas, say the Belt and Road, where the narrative is quite negative against these infrastructure projects, and perhaps China has a valid argument that these projects actually benefit the region. I think in the South China Sea, its perspectives don't quite gel with reality, as well as the situation or the rights permitted under international law.
Right. I recall Professor Mahowani addressing this issue in the context of China's sort of congenital insecurity that it's a massive populous country with not enough natural resources, and hence it always feels that it needs to have some degree of buffer, something that the U.S. pursued, I guess, in the last century or so, and hence enjoys hegemonic supremacy in the vicinity of the United States and North America. So his point was that China sort of craves that. But you're right that from its regional partners' perspective, I think also China has done a poor job of building friendships. It has a lot of eager economic partners, but genuine friends, hard to find. Lynn, recently, both you and I were actually on a call with U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, and in which I was kind of struck that he really strenuously highlighted the importance of the U.S.-India defense relationship. I mean, so far in this talk, we've discussed Southeast Asia, but I think it would be remiss to not talk about this issue where the U.S. seems to be putting more emphasis. What role can middle powers like India play in this whole China-US strife?
I think with great power competition, which is dramatically worsening the strategic environment in the region, the importance of the contributions of middle powers increases. And I think I see their role as twofold. First, to maintain the balance of power in the region, and second, to strenuously defend the rules-based order. I think India as a naval power, or even powers like Australia, Japan, they need to be able to continuously or regularly assert maritime rights and freedoms to ensure that the vital waterways of our region remain open. I think as a matter of law, this ensures that passage and other high sea freedoms are not lost through lack of use. And as a matter of practice, it ensures that international waters do not become a Chinese lake. The other role that middle powers can do is to work with other allies and partners to build capacity in the region, whether in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief or in enhancing maritime domain awareness, which helps to give coastal states greater confidence in dealing with coercive behavior or unlawful behavior in the waters around them. And I think finally, and perhaps most importantly, middle powers need to be able to keep in mind that when attempting to defend a rules-based order in a region where development needs are very high, they are only likely to gain traction if they are able to afford development opportunities to the region as well. Now, China is an attractive partner to many of the countries in the region, not because of ideology, going back to the earlier arguments that we made, but because of the opportunity that China offers for these countries to, to become more connected, to develop themselves, to lift themselves out of poverty. And I think this needs to be very much at the forefront of middle powers' thoughts when they consider how they should be dealing with the region. We must not forget that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and post-pandemic, countries are going to be seeking to rebuild, their economies. They're going to need to bolster their healthcare systems, and this is something that middle powers can very much step into a role to play. So, India probably has its own challenges as well, and perhaps might not be able to play that strong a role in terms of the development of healthcare systems. But India has certainly great medical expertise that can be offered to the rest of the region, and it can also work with its partners like the United States, Japan, and Australia in terms of infrastructure, working on infrastructure investment in the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't need to work alone, but it can work with its partners and allies. So I think India is clearly an important Indo-Pacific actor that's been identified in the various policy documents that the United States has issued. While we've seen Australia and Japan very much step up to the plate in terms of seeking to play a greater strategic role in the region, I think there's still a big question mark over the extent to which India is willing to engage more with the region in terms from a security or strategic perspective. And I think its recent withdrawal from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, has hurt its ability to shape and influence the region. But I think with recent clashes with China on their disputed border, there's a possibility that we might see India move beyond its traditional non-alignment policy, which has constrained deeper security ties. There's already been reports of it planning on inviting Australia to join its high-level naval exercise Malabar, which usually involves the navies of India, Japan, and the United States. So it still remains to be seen whether or not recent developments on its border will lead to greater strategic engagement, sustained strategic engagement in the region moving forwards. But in my view, I think old habits of non-alignment will probably die quite hard.
No, I absolutely. You've hit the nail with your hammer, Lynn, because, India has been a non-aligned actor for a very long time, and it's served itself pretty well. As you were alluding to earlier about trade partnership, China is the biggest trade partner of India now. And the recent strife, I sometimes wonder whether, the bromance between Trump and Modi explains a lot of this sort of convergence between India and the US, or as you said, there are policy documents which have also identified India as a critical middle power. But the irony, you were talking about how India can play a constructive role because of its expertise in pharmaceutical production and so on. The country that had the biggest window with this was China. This is what I find amazing, that the last 4 months was China's biggest window to impress the world with its helping hand, both in terms of fighting this pandemic, as well as debt forgiveness for poor nations that have taken on Chinese debt. And it seems to me that window has narrowed, and China really has not been able to exploit that. And now, of course, we have the situation where, as you have rightly said, there is cause for alarm that the rising tension and no sign of backing down by these two strong nations is putting our region under a great deal of stress. Lynn, any parting words in terms of the very near-term outlook? In the next 6 months or so, what's your sense in the region?
I think it's going to be a region that will be looking at developments in some alarm. I think it's really a very rapidly deteriorating security situation, and it's going to be a very watchful region. But it's also going to be a region that might be staying put, because in the next, few months, it's going to be what is the outcome of the US elections going to be, and thereafter assessing whether this recent dramatic downturn in US-China relations has been just a factor of the upcoming US elections or something far deeper. And I suspect it's going to be they're going to find out that it was something deeper, more structural problems in the US-China relationship. And then the region is going to be looking forwards in terms of what is it going to do next. Like I mentioned earlier, the region has a narrowing set of options, but I think what it should be seeking to do is to keep those options open as much as possible, not by failing to take any sides at all, but by adhering by firmly planting themselves on the side of international law and norms. And I think in this way, by taking a very principled approach, the region can thereby, ensure that it doesn't anger China as much by saying that, no, this isn't about being anti-China, but it's about adhering to the rule of law, and also ensure that, it still keeps the US somewhat satisfied because it shows itself willing to stick its neck out for principles and therefore worthy of further support and assistance from the United States and its allies and partners.
Right. We all crave a rules-based multilateral order. Thank you so much for your insightful views, Lynn Kuok. Greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been great. Thanks also to our listeners. Martin Taki produced Kopi Time, which is available on YouTube and major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can also find our live streams, webinars, and research publication by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.